Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Yesterday, you hopefully would have seen Steve's big benchmark video looking at how Resident Evil 2 performs with a large number of GPUs. The general consensus seems to be that the game runs very well on mid-range hardware, with something like the GTX 1060 or RX 570 offering above 60 FPS at 1080p max settings, the GTX 1070 being good enough for 1440p, and the 1080 Ti almost hitting 60 FPS at 4K. But there's also a lot of quality settings in the game, and in many cases, it's not necessary to run on the maximum settings to get the best mix of performance and visuals. This is a stunning game in general that uses a wide variety of effects to deliver a fantastic presentation. However, some settings are particularly performance intensive. So in this video, I'll be going through every setting in Resident Evil 2 to show you how it impacts both visual quality and performance. I'll be making a few recommendations along the way for settings to turn down or tweak, and then at the end, we'll compare maximum settings with our custom settings profile. The goal is to gain as much performance with as little reduction to visuals, either to allow those with lower end cards to hit 60 FPS or those with faster cards to start pushing up to 100 plus FPS. Few bits of standard housekeeping before we get into it. All testing was done on my Core i9-9900K test rig with 16GB of RAM and a variety of modern GPUs from both AMD and Nvidia, with results averaged. All footage was captured at 4K using an RTX 2080, and we recommend watching this video at 4K because it can be hard to spot the differences in some settings at lower quality levels on YouTube. We also have a full source quality file of this video at 100 megabits available to download for our Patreons. Resident Evil 2 seems like one of those games that was designed with PC in mind. We're getting a great selection of presets here in conjunction with fairly basic visual representations of each setting, along with bars that indicate the visual and performance impact. For people unfamiliar with the settings, this is a great sort of menu to have. The main annoyance straight out here is the VRAM usage indicator, which can quickly balloon to well over 8GB depending on the configuration you set. When the amount of VRAM the game thinks it will be using exceeds the amount of VRAM you have, warnings will start to pop up. I'm mostly concerned about these warnings scaring off gamers from trying higher quality settings, because as far as I can tell, exceeding the VRAM limit has no real performance impact. I happily gamed on an 8GB card with the game saying it required more than 13GB of VRAM on the max settings, so the warnings are a bit aggressive. It's really only with lower end cards, those with 4GB of VRAM or lower, that it can have an effect. The other setting, which may not be obvious as to which mode is better, is the DirectX option. Steve covered this in his video yesterday. The game runs universally better in the DirectX 11 mode, so there's no reason at all to use DirectX 12 unless you enjoy, I guess, lower frame rates for no difference in visuals. So for presets, we have 4 different options I'll be going through, plus a recommended mode that I won't cover. The 4 main presets are Max, Graphics Priority, Balanced, and Performance Priority. In a lot of scenarios, there are only very minor differences between Max and Balanced, with small reductions to volumetric lighting quality and shadows. It's only when you get down to the Performance Priority mode that more features begin to be disabled or toned down, including screen space reflections and ambient occlusion. It's also worth mentioning there are still settings that can be turned down below what is set using the Performance Priority mode. This lowest mode has even further reduced visuals, but remarkably still looks quite decent considering the changes. My advice here is pretty straightforward when looking at performance. Most gamers should use the balanced mode. It delivers 31% more performance on average straight away, with nearly a 50% uplift in 1% low performance, all for almost imperceptible changes in visual quality throughout many areas I tested. If you really want slightly better visuals, even then I would choose the graphics priority mode over max settings, simply because I could not tell a difference between the two. Rendering mode is a setting I'd only touch on low-end systems. Using the interlaced mode here rather than normal results in noticeable shimmering and artifacts, as it's essentially using a really crappy temporal reconstruction. In motion, it's even more noticeable than in these static scenes. The benefit to using interlaced rendering is a 50% gain to performance. However, again, I'd make other tweaks before turning this mode on. Anti-aliasing is, in my opinion, the most disappointing quality option in the game. There are 5 modes here, SMAA, TAA, FXAA, and a combination of both TAA and FXAA, plus of course no anti-aliasing. None of these options are particularly amazing. Both TAA and TAA plus FXAA are extremely soft due to a mediocre TAA implementation. The detail loss is so severe I'd call this a blur filter more than anti-aliasing. SMAA preserves the most detail, but you do get some shimmering, less so than FXAA and off however. Had the RE Engine's TAA been half decent, I think a combination of TAA and SMAA, like is used in some other games, would have struck a great balance between detail and jaggy reduction. But as is, you have to either put up with a super soft TAA or a not completely adequate SMAA aside from super sampling through the resolution slider. My choice here would be SMAA, and I've used it across the rest of testing as TAA is simply too blurry to spot some detail changes. Looking at performance, there's no significant difference between SMAA and the two TAA options. Using FXAA or no AA delivers a 3 to 4% performance improvement, but since SMAA is visually superior, it gets my recommendation here. Texture quality is a pretty crazy setting in Resident Evil 2 because there are so many options. There are 3 base texture modes, we get high, medium and low, but then there's also numerous VRAM amounts listed beside these modes. Presumably these VRAM numbers are an indicator of how much VRAM the game will use for textures, with 8GB allocating up to 8GB, 2GB allocating up to 2GB, and so on. On an 8GB card like the RTX 2080, there was no performance difference between any of the texture modes, so whether I set the game to 8GB or 0.25GB, there was no difference to either average or 1% low performance. At best, I saw a 1 to 2% improvement using medium or low textures, but across the 8 high modes, margins were so small they were negligible, and this was with the 8GB mode apparently using more than 13GB of VRAM. As I mentioned before, it's really only with VRAM constrained cards like the GTX 1060 3GB that this setting makes any real difference. For gamers with 6GB or more VRAM, I'd recommend using the high mode at 8GB, though if you find there is stuttering, it could be worth turning down the VRAM amount. Medium saw virtually no loss to quality and could be an option for those with VRAM limited GPUs, while low is really potato quality and I wouldn't recommend it here. Texture filter quality is a standard setting found in most games. Here we have anisotropic filtering ranging from 2x to 16x, plus both bilinear and trilinear modes for low-end GPUs. You'll notice for these ground textures that the higher the mode, the further into the distance you'll see clear textures, with the non-anisotropic modes being particularly blurry. Across mid-range GPUs and up, I saw at most a 1.5% improvement switching from 16x anisotropic to trilinear, which is a typical gain. However, trilinear looks pretty mediocre. I'd recommend sticking to 16 times here on everything but low-end GPUs. Mesh quality is another one of those settings that only has a significant impact with low-end cards. If you have a mid-range GPU or up, you shouldn't spot any difference in performance between any of the 4 modes. I also didn't spot any significant changes to visuals aside from a minor loss in detail to some models at the lowest setting. I'd keep this on max where possible. The shadows in Resident Evil 2 are some of the game's best effects, particularly the shadows cast from the direct beam of your torch. It's the dynamic nature of these shadows in dark environments that adds to the atmosphere in a big way. As for shadow quality, the only major change I could spot between the 5 modes was in the resolution of shadows in various scenes, whether cast from your torch or other light sources. There are only slight differences between high and max shadows, with some slight losses to resolution moving to high. Then when shifting down to medium, the resolution downgrade becomes a bit more noticeable. The biggest change is in the move to low shadows, where the poor resolution really starts to show. Then we have the min shadow mode, which has very aliased and quite ugly shadows. Looking at the performance differences, you can group things into 3 brackets. At the top, max is the most intensive, then high and medium both deliver roughly 3% more performance, while low and minimum deliver a 5% performance uplift. My recommendation here is to use the high mode. You'll get roughly 3% more performance on average than max, with only a very small change to shadow quality, and it's a good compromise to make. Shadow cache appears to be a setting that allows you to trade performance for VRAM utilization with no noticeable change to visuals. Turning the cache off lowers VRAM usage slightly at the expense of a 4% reduction to performance. For almost every gamer, leaving this setting on makes the most sense. It's only on VRAM constricted cards where swapping out information to system memory all the time causes a larger than 4% performance hit that you might consider turning the cache off. Contact shadows is an extension of the shadow system. With this feature enabled, items in the scene can shadow themselves from an incident light source rather than just shadow the environment around them. It adds depth and realism to the lighting system, and depending on the area can be noticeable in a subtle way. This is one of the more performance-intensive individual settings. Disabling contact shadows improves performance by 4% on average. For those with powerful systems, I'd recommend leaving this setting enabled for the added visuals, but for those with more entry-level GPUs, it's something I'd switch off to gain additional performance. Next up is screen space reflections, a typical effect used in many games. Resident Evil 2 makes extensive use of SSR for both water and shiny interior surfaces. However, the implementation, in my opinion, isn't great. There's a lot of grain and noise to reflections in some circumstances, indicative of, I guess, a low sampling count. Surprisingly, it looks kind of like ray trace reflections with the level of noise, but obviously with a more computationally simple technique. To make matters worse, your character often obscures the reflection, so you get noticeable, I guess, a seam between areas with and without SSR. I feel like another reflection technique probably would have been better here visually. In any case, there's quite a substantial difference between SSR on and off across the game world. It's a simple case of either there are reflections or there aren't, but the world looks much more realistic with the effect enabled, despite the low sample count in some areas. However, SSR also has a huge performance impact. You'll gain more than 11% to your frame rate on average with the effect disabled. For those with beefy GPUs, I'd still recommend keeping SSR on for the visual improvement it makes, but on performance constrained systems, it's an easy setting to turn off. An even easier setting to turn down is subsurface scattering. This is an effect that makes a subtle difference to how character models are rendered, in particular skin surfaces in close-up cutscenes. But the effect isn't all that noticeable in my opinion, and the effect comes with a decent performance hit, not just in cutscenes, but also in general play. Disabling subsurface scattering leads to a 4% improvement, which I would recommend doing. Volumetric lighting is the most demanding setting in the game. It also helps establish a foggy atmosphere that I feel is crucial to the experience. That's not to say the atmosphere is terrible with the effect disabled, just that having volumetric lighting adds a lot to this game in particular, unlike a game such as Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Each of the 3 volumetric lighting modes impacts the sampling count of the effect, with high having the densest haze and the highest sampling count. That said, there's no significant difference between high and medium in my opinion. It's only when you switch to low that you get a slight loss in quality. Disabling the effect entirely also has a huge impact on the visuals, and I wouldn't recommend this mode unless you're running on low-end hardware. In terms of performance, switching volumetric lighting from high to medium is the first and most obvious setting to change in the game. This provides a 12% uplift to average frame rates and a 25% improvement to 1% low, so the game will also feel substantially smoother with this small change. If you're hunting for a bit more performance, I'd set this setting to low. Particle lighting quality changes whether particles interact with light sources or not. With this setting enabled, you'll see rain shimmer beneath street lamps, for example. This effect has a minor impact on performance. Disabling it gives an extra 1 to 2%, so I'd really only recommend disabling it if you're searching for extra frames. Ambient Occlusion is an interesting one. There are 4 modes plus an off state split between 3 techniques. The most taxing setting is HBAO+, then there's HDAO, and then there's 2 SSAO modes, with 1 mode limiting SSAO to certain locations. Each of the 3 modes renders ambient occlusion in a different way, giving a different effect. Which one you like may be a personal preference, however, I think SSAO looks best to my eye. And SSAO is the least taxing method, delivering an 8% performance uplift over HBAO+, while HBAO+ and HDAO are equivalent in their performance. This is an easy choice to make. I'd set the game to use SSAO and enjoy the extra frames. Now we're moving into more cosmetic and personal preference settings, starting with bloom. Again, this is something I feel adds to the atmosphere considerably, so I'd leave it enabled. However, if you don't like the effect or want around 3% more performance, it can be disabled. Lens flare is a purely cosmetic feature. There is no difference in performance between the 2 modes. Motion blur usually comes down to personal preference unless I'm playing at super high frame rates. I like to leave the setting enabled most of the time. However, you will gain 4 to 5% more performance with it disabled due to the RE Engine's decent motion blur implementation. Depth of field is another effect that has no impact on performance, which is the same with lens distortion and film noise. Personally, I'd turn lens distortion off. Film noise is subtle enough that you'll barely notice it whether it's enabled or not, while I'd leave depth of field enabled. So as for our overall recommendation, I've essentially built two profiles here. One I'll call Hub Graphics for those with beefy systems that want this game looking great, and a Hub Performance mode that is more geared towards maximum frame rates. The Hub Graphics mode has most settings maximized with a few exceptions. I've turned anti-aliasing from FXAA plus TAA to just SMAA for a sharper presentation. I've also turned shadows to high, subsurface scattering is disabled, volumetric lighting is on medium, and ambient occlusion is set to SSAO. This fairly modest set of changes delivers a 31% performance improvement over maximum settings for effectively no change to visual quality. In fact, with the change to anti-aliasing, I'd say this preset actually looks better than the max preset, which uses TAA plus FXAA. Our custom Hub Graphics mode performs around the same mark as the balance preset, but with noticeable changes. Our preset has better texture filtering, sharper shadows, higher mesh quality, and full SSAO, which come at little to no performance cost. Aside from those free bonuses, the main change is swapping subsurface scattering for increased volumetric lighting quality, which I feel has a larger visual impact in general gameplay. Our Hub Performance preset is really geared towards maximizing frame rates, delivering an over 80% boost compared to max settings, and that tends to be higher on more entry-level cards as VRAM usage also declines. This preset is the same as Hub Graphics except for several things disabled. Contact shadows, screen space reflections, bloom and motion blur are all turned off, while particle lighting and volumetric lighting are set to low. Again, this preset performs slightly worse than the performance priority mode. However, the performance priority mode has several things set to their lowest values, including shadows, mesh quality, and ambient occlusion. With our custom Hub preset, we're still using high shadows, maximum texture filtering, SSAO, and SMAA, which all improve visuals with only minor performance hits. Here's a brief summary of the two presets in case you want to use them. Maybe pause here because in a second or so I'll be moving right along. In general, I think it's quite difficult to make Resident Evil 2 look bad. Even with the lowest possible setting selected, the game still looks good and runs even better than it already does. Having such a large difference in performance between maximum and minimum quality settings also allows a wide variety of PC gamers with all sorts of configurations to enjoy this game. So it's both a fantastic looking game and one that scales well, which points to a very high quality effort on the PC version. With our collection of optimal settings, we're looking at a 30% performance uplift compared to maximum settings for no noticeable quality loss. This brings GPUs like the RX 580 and the GTX 1060 into calculations for high quality 1440p 60fps experiences, which is a great result for mid-range GPUs, and that's credit to Capcom for their work on this title. That's it for this investigation into Resident Evil 2. If you missed Steve's big GPU benchmark, please go back and watch that, it's definitely worth it. As always, you can subscribe for more graphics optimization videos looking at the schedule. I guess the next game getting this treatment will likely be, I think it's Metro Exodus, so stay tuned for that in February. Consider supporting us on Patreon to get access to our Discord community, and I'll catch you in the next one.